In any system of belief, there's this one question that really sits at the heart of everything. Who gets to make the rules? Well, today we're diving into a source that gives a pretty provocative answer. It argues that maybe, just maybe, the true source of authority has been, well, misunderstood.
So let's start with a classic. Is alcohol forbidden in the Quran? You've heard this one, right? It gets debated endlessly, and people have really strong feelings about it. On the surface, it seems like it should be a simple yes or no answer, doesn't it? But the source we're digging into today says that's completely the wrong question to be asking. What if the whole debate is flawed from the start? The argument here is that by focusing on the substance, we're totally missing the point. Because the real question is this: who has the authority to decide? See, this isn't just about one little rule. This is about the very source of divine law itself. It's about who believers are actually meant to listen to. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to tackle that question of authority, get a handle on some key concepts from the Quran itself, and then look at three big case studies: alcohol, veiling, and even core doctrine. And then we'll wrap it all up with the source's powerful final conclusion. So let's jump right in. The entire argument we're exploring today is built on one single critical idea about where authority is supposed to lie. Okay, so here's the core argument in a nutshell. When a ruling from a secondary text, a tradition or a scholarly opinion, goes beyond or even contradicts the Quran, the problem isn't just about that one rule. It's much deeper. The problem becomes structural. It's like authority that belongs only to God's revelation has been given away to something or someone else. Okay, to really get our heads around this, we need to define a few key terms straight from the Quran. Think of this as our toolkit for understanding the rest of this whole argument. First up, we have Tawheed. Now, this is the absolute bedrock of Islamic theology, God's oneness. But the key thing here is that it's not just about God being one in number, it means God is the one and only legitimate source of divine law, period. And this is where things get really interesting. The opposite of Tawheed is shirk, and the source defines it not just as, bowing to a statue, but as a misassignment of authority. It's what happens when you treat the rulings of humans, scholars, traditions, whatever, as if they have the same weight as God's own words. And last but not least, a super important word for this whole discussion, khamr. It's often just translated as wine or alcohol, but its literal root means to cover or to veil. The argument is that its real meaning is anything that clouds your mind and obscures your moral judgment. You're going to want to hang on to that definition because it is absolutely crucial for what comes next. All right, with those definitions locked in, let's look at our first case study, alcohol. The source says this is a crystal clear example of that pattern of misassigned authority in action. So, the source points out that the Quran deals with this issue step by step. First, there's an ethical evaluation. Hey, the harm here is greater than the benefit. Then comes a condition. Don't pray while you're intoxicated. Notice the focus on the mental state. And finally, you get a directive to avoid things that veil the mind, putting it in the same category as things like gambling that mess with your judgment. And this table just lays out the shift perfectly. The Quran talks about the condition, intoxication, and uses the word avoid. Later rulings, they focus on the substance, alcohol, and use the word prohibition, or haram. So the focus moves from a principle that guides your own moral choices to a blanket legal ban. It's a subtle but massive shift. Let's move on to our next case study. According to the source, we're about to see the exact same pattern of, let's call it, interpretive expansion when it comes to the topic of veiling. So in the Quran, you have this very specific functional instruction. Take the head coverings you're already wearing and draw them over the chest area. It's a very practical command about modesty. But as the source points out, later jurisprudence takes that one specific instruction and expands it into a universal mandate to cover the hair, basically turning a specific instruction into a totalizing religious law that isn't explicitly spelled out in the primary text. Okay, now for our final case study, and this one might be the most profound. The source applies this same exact framework not just to rules about behavior, but to the very foundations of doctrine, specifically beliefs about the figure of Isa, or Jesus. The Quran makes several really direct, unambiguous statements. It talks about his birth, death, and resurrection in that specific order. It calls him God's word and a spirit from him, and it says that God raised him to himself. The source notes that the language here is incredibly precise and consistent. But wouldn't you know it, the same pattern pops up again. The source argues that later theological traditions bring in new ideas that end up qualifying or even contradicting these direct statements. For instance, the idea that Isa didn't actually die. By doing this, these interpretations basically force you to read the Quran through their lens, which effectively overrides its plain and simple meaning. So, we've walked through 3 huge examples: alcohol, veiling, and doctrine. And now we get to the source's big conclusion, which brings us all the way back to that key term we talked about at the beginning. And here it is. This is the core irony. Remember Khamr, the thing that veils the intellect? The source argues that rigid inherited laws, when you follow them without thinking or without checking them against the Quran, can become a kind of Khamr themselves. They can actually cloud your moral clarity and replace your own conscious thought with just blind obedience. Which just leaves us with this incredible question to chew on. Is it possible for a system of rules designed to bring people clarity and righteousness to end up doing the exact opposite? To end up veiling the mind in the very way the Quran warns against? Now, to be super clear, the point here isn't to just throw out all tradition. Not at all. It's a call for a reprioritization. It's about re-anchoring all that scholarship and all that jurisprudence so that it's held accountable to the Quran, making sure that the primary text always remains the final authority. And that really just leaves us with one final big thought. When we talk about being faithful to a sacred text, what does that truly require? Does it mean following every single interpretation that's ever come from it? Or is it a constant, conscious struggle to always return to the source itself as the ultimate guide and the ultimate measure for absolutely everything?